Left to die among dragons, 8-year-old Kira pressed her face into the scorching ash and wondered why the grown-ups had lied about heaven being beautiful. The wasteland stretched endlessly around her, a hellscape of blackened stone and smouldering earth where nothing good could ever grow. Every breath burned her lungs with sulfur and smoke. Every heartbeat echoed in the terrible silence where her village's screams had finally stopped. The ground beneath her small body radiated heat like a baker's oven, but she didn't dare move. Moving meant looking at what remained of the others. Scattered bones picked clean by scavengers, scraps of familiar cloth now stained with ash and worse things. Her mother's blue headscarf lay twisted around a charred timber not 10 paces away. Kira squeezed her eyes shut and tried to remember her mother's face, but all she could see was fire and the great shadow that had swept down from the mountains 3 days ago. She had hidden then, crammed herself into the root cellar, while the world above burned and roared and died. When silence finally came, she climbed out to find emptiness. The dragons had taken everything, homes, people, hope. Everything except one small girl who wasn't worth the effort to kill. Her left palm throbbed with a dull ache, the strange mark there, seeming to pulse with its own rhythm. It had appeared the night before the attack, a perfect spiral of raised skin that looked almost like a brand, though she'd touched no fire. Her mother had stared at it with frightened eyes and whispered prayers Kira didn't understand. Now her mother was ash, and the mark remained. A distant rumble shook the ground, sending tremors through her exhausted body. Kira lifted her head just enough to peer across the wasteland. Far above, a dark shape circled against the smoke-hazed sky, too large to be a bird, too graceful to be anything but death on wings. Her breath caught in her throat. The dragons had returned. She pressed herself flatter against the burning earth, ignoring the way it seared through her torn dress. The mark on her palm grew warmer, almost hot now, as if responding to some unseen presence. High overhead, the shadow wheeled closer, and Kira closed her eyes again, waiting. She was so small, so alone, so tired of being afraid. If this was how her story ended, at least it would end quickly. At least she wouldn't have to wonder anymore. Why she'd been the only one left behind. Why she'd survived when stronger, better people had not. The shadow grew larger, blotting out what little sun pierced the smoky air. Soon now. Very soon. In the distance, something else moved through the ash fields. Something that walked on 2 legs instead of flying on scaled wings. The dragon's shadow fell across Kira like a death shroud, blocking out the dying sun and turning the ash fields darker than midnight. She could hear it now, the whisper of massive wings cutting through smoke-thick air, the rumble of breath that could melt stone. Her small body trembled against the scorched earth as the beast circled lower, lower, until she could smell the sulfur on its breath and feel the heat radiating from its scales. This was how it ended. This was how all the stories ended in the wasteland. Then came a sound she'd never heard before, the ring of steel on steel, sharp and bright as a bell tower's call. Something metallic struck the ground near her head with tremendous force, sending up a spray of ash and ember. The dragon's rumble changed pitch, became a roar of surprise and fury. "Get down, child!" The voice was deep, rough as grinding stone, but somehow warm beneath its harshness. "Stay low and don't move!" Kira lifted her head just enough to see him, a man in battered armor that had once been silver but now bore the black scars of dragonfire. He stood between her and the circling beast, a great sword gleaming in his gauntleted hands. His helmet was dented, his cloak torn and singed, but he planted his feet wide and raised his blade like he meant to fight the sky itself. The dragon dove. For a moment the world became nothing but fire and fury, the crash of claws against steel, the knight's hoarse shout mixing with the beast's shriek. Kira pressed her face into the ash and tried to make herself smaller, invisible. The heat washed over her in waves, so intense she thought her hair might catch flame. Then silence fell like a curtain. She waited, heart hammering, until a gentle touch on her shoulder made her flinch. The knight knelt beside her, his sword sheathed, his helmet tucked under one arm. His face was weathered and scarred, grey beard singed at the edges, but his eyes held a kindness that made her chest ache with something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. He didn't speak. Instead, he simply held out his hand, palm up, waiting, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. His gauntlets were removed now, and she could see the calluses on his fingers, the old burns that matched her own. Kira stared at that outstretched hand for a long moment. She had learned not to trust grown-ups, learned that their promises turned to ash as quickly as everything else. But this man had fought a dragon for her. This man had stayed when everyone else had run. Slowly, carefully, she placed her small hand in his much larger one. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and for the first time in 3 days, Kira felt safe. The dragon was gone. The night was here. And maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. The cave was hidden so well that Kira would have walked past it 100 times without noticing. The knight, Sir Gareth, he'd told her quietly as they climbed, led her through a narrow crack, between 2 boulders that opened into a space barely large enough for both of them. But it was dry, and it was safe, and after 3 days in the ash fields it felt like a palace. He set her down gently on a bed of old furs that smelled like leather and wood smoke. Real smells, human smells, so different from the sulphur and death. She'd been breathing. Her torn dress was more holes than fabric now, and her arms were covered in cuts from crawling through the wasteland. The strange mark on her palm had stopped throbbing, but it still felt warm against her skin. "Let me see," Gareth said, his voice softer now that they were away from the dragons. He knelt before her, moving slowly like he was approaching a frightened animal. When she held out her arm, he examined the cuts with careful fingers, his touch so gentle she barely felt it. He worked in silence, cleaning her wounds with water from a leather pouch and wrapping them in strips torn from his own cloak. She watched his face in the flickering light of a small fire he'd built, the lines around his eyes, the grey in his beard, the way he bit his lip when concentrating. He looked tired, old, like he'd been fighting dragons for a very long time. "There was a girl once," he said suddenly, not looking up from her bandaged arm. "About your age, brown hair, brown eyes, stubborn as a mule." His hands stilled for a moment. She used to collect beetles in little wooden boxes, drove her mother to distraction. Kira's throat felt tight. What happened to her? "Dragons," he said simply. "Same as always." She wanted to say she was sorry, wanted to offer comfort the way adults had once comforted her, but the words felt too small for something so large, so she just nodded and let him finish with her bandages. When he was done, he pulled a piece of dried meat from his pack and handed it to her. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. Real food. When had she last eaten real food? "What's your name, little one?" he asked. "Kira." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Kira." He repeated it like he was tasting the sound. "That's a strong name. A survivor's name." She touched the mark on her palm through the bandage. "Sir Gareth, why didn't the dragon kill you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he looked at her with those kind, tired eyes and said, "Maybe it wasn't my time yet. Maybe I still had something left to do." Outside the cave, something howled in the distance. Not quite dragon, not quite wolf, but something hungry in the dark. The howling came closer as darkness fell over the wasteland like a burial shroud. Gareth had extinguished their small fire hours ago, and now they sat in absolute blackness at the mouth of the cave, listening to the sounds that prowled the valley below. Not dragons. These were smaller, hungrier things that hunted in packs when the great beast slept. "Dragonkin," Gareth whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Lesser cousins. but they have teeth just the same. Kira pressed herself against the cave wall, trying to become part of the stone itself. She could hear them now. The scrape of claws on rock, the wet sound of sniffing, the low growls that seemed to echo from multiple throats. They were searching, following some scent trail that led inexorably toward their hiding place. Gareth's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers closing around her small ones with steady pressure. She could feel the tension in his body, the coiled readiness of a warrior who had fought these battles before. His sword lay across his knees, and she knew without seeing that his other hand rested on its hilt. A shadow moved past the cave entrance, sinuous, wrong-shaped, too long in the neck and too low to the ground. Another followed it, then another. The pack was circling, cutting off escape routes that didn't exist anyway. Kira's heart hammered so loud she was certain the creatures would hear it. One of them stopped directly outside their hiding place. She could see its outline now, scaled like a dragon, but built like a hunting hound, with burning amber eyes that swept the darkness. It tilted its head, listening, testing the air with a forked tongue. The mark on Kira's palm began to burn. She bit back a gasp as heat spread up her arm, the spiral pattern glowing with a faint blue light that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Gareth's grip tightened on her hand. He could see it too, the soft radiance seeping through her bandages. Like captured starlight, the dragonkin outside hissed and stepped back, its eyes fixed on the cave entrance. For a moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the threshold. Then the creature's lips pulled back from needle-sharp teeth, and it lunged. Gareth was already moving, his sword singing from its sheath to meet claws and fangs in a clash of steel and fury. But there were more behind it, too many for one knight to face. Kira scrambled backward as another dragonkin squeezed through the narrow opening, its amber eyes locked on her glowing hand. The light grew brighter, hot against her skin, and suddenly the creature stopped mid-lunge. It actually whimpered, and backed away as if the light itself was burning it. "Stay behind me," Gareth commanded, but his voice held a new note now. Wonder, recognition. The dragonkin retreated into the night, leaving only silence and the fading glow from a little girl's palm. They reached Millhaven at midday, though calling it by name felt like mockery now. The village where Kira had been born, where she'd learned to walk and speak and laugh, was nothing but blackened timber and ash-covered stone. Even the well in the center square had collapsed, its stones scattered like broken teeth across ground that still held the ghost warmth of dragonfire. Kira stood at the edge of what had once been the market street, her small hand tight in Gareth's weathered one. She had known it would look like this, had seen the flames from her hiding place in the root cellar, but knowing and seeing were different creatures entirely. "There," she whispered, pointing to a pile of charred beams that had once been Widow, Mara's bakery. "She used to give me honey cakes when Mother wasn't looking." Gareth said nothing, but his thumb rubbed gentle circles across her knuckles. He understood the weight of empty places, the way familiar corners could hold more ghosts than any graveyard. They walked deeper into the ruins, past the blackened skeleton of the inn where travelling merchants had told stories of distant lands, past the smithy where Master Corwin had let her pump the bellows on feast days. Everything was ash and memory now, but with each step, the memories grew sharper, clearer, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting light. "I remember now," Kira said suddenly, stopping before the remains of her own cottage. The roof had caved in completely, but she could still see the corner where her sleeping pallet had been, where her mother's herb bundles had hung from the rafters. The mark appeared the night before. Mother saw it and went pale as milk. She knelt and brushed ash away from a fragment of blue pottery, part of her mother's favorite bowl. She said it was a sign, a curse, that the dragons would come for me and anyone who sheltered me would burn. Her voice grew smaller. She was right. Gareth crouched beside her, his armor creaking softly. "That's why they left you in the wasteland. They thought if you were gone, the village would be spared." Kira nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the ash on her cheeks. "But it didn't work. They came anyway. Everyone died anyway." She touched the bandage mark on her palm. "It's my fault." "No." Gareth's voice was firm, final. "Dragons don't need reasons to burn. They don't need excuses to kill. What happened here would have happened with or without you." But Kira wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at something, half buried beneath a fallen beam, a piece of parchment somehow untouched by the flames. She pulled it free with trembling fingers. The writing was in her mother's careful hand. "If the marked child lives, the old pact dies with her. The dragons remember what we have tried to forget." The mountain path to Dragon's Eye Peak was little, more than a goat track carved into stone that seemed to touch the very clouds. Kira's legs ached from the climb, but she pressed on beside Gareth, driven by the need to understand the words her mother had left behind. The old pact. What did it mean? And why did the dragons remember when the humans had forgotten? The air grew thinner with each step, and stranger too. It tasted of copper and lightning, of something ancient that made her teeth ache, and the mark on her palm throb in rhythm with her heartbeat. Below them, the wasteland spread out like a burned tapestry, while above, the peak loomed, a jagged spear of black rock that seemed to pierce the sky itself. "This is madness," Gareth muttered, pausing to catch his breath. His armor, which had seemed so formidable in the valley, now felt like dead weight dragging him toward the abyss. No human has climbed this high and lived to tell of it. But Kira barely heard him. Something was calling to her from the summit, not a sound but a feeling, a pull in her very bones that grew stronger with every step. The mark on her palm had begun to glow again, soft blue light seeping through her bandages like trapped starfire. They rounded a bend in the path and Kira gasped. Before them stretched a vast ledge, carved smooth by centuries of wind and weather. Ancient symbols covered the stone, spirals and circles and flowing script that seemed to shift and dance when she wasn't looking directly at them. And at the center of it all, a pool of water so still it might have been polished obsidian. "A roosting sight," Gareth breathed. "This is where they come to rest between flights." As if summoned by his words, a shadow passed overhead. Then another. Kira looked up to see 3 dragons circling above them, their scales gleaming like jewels in the afternoon sun. They should have attacked immediately, should have turned the ledge into a furnace of flame and fury. Instead, they landed. The largest, a creature of midnight blue with eyes like molten gold, folded its wings and stepped forward, its gaze fixed on Kira with an intelligence that made her breath catch. When it opened its mouth, she expected the roar that meant death. Instead, it spoke. The words were in no language she had ever heard, yet somehow she understood them perfectly. They resonated in her bones, in the mark on her palm that now blazed, like a tiny sun. "Little sister," the dragon said, its voice like distant thunder, "you have finally come home." Kira felt power surge through her, not the flickering light that had driven off the dragonkin, but something vast and terrible and wonderful. Light poured from her skin, her eyes, her very breath. Gareth stared at her in wonder and growing fear. "What are you?" They descended from Dragon's Eye Peak in silence, both shaken by what had transpired on that ancient ledge. The dragon's words, "Little sister," echoed in Kira's mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. She was something more than human, something the dragons recognized as kin. But what that meant frightened her more than all the monsters in the wasteland. Gareth led them to a sheltered valley where a thin stream wound between moss-covered stones. Real grass grew here, green and soft, the first living thing Kira had seen since the ash fields. He built a fire without speaking, his movements mechanical, distant. The light that had poured from her on the peak had changed something between them. She could feel it in the careful space he kept, in the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "You're afraid of me now," she said finally, her voice small in the gathering dusk. Gareth paused in his work, a half-peeled apple forgotten in his weathered hands. "Not afraid," he said slowly. "Confused. Wondering if I've been protecting you, or if you've been protecting me." She curled her knees to her chest, feeling suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. "I don't understand what's happening to me. I don't understand any of this." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of burning wood and the distant whisper of wind through grass. Then Gareth set down his knife and looked at her directly for the first time since the dragons spoke. "I came here 3 months ago," he said, his voice rough with old pain. 10 knights, sent by the king to establish a garrison in the borderlands. We were going to push back the dragons, reclaim the lost territories." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Fools, children playing at war. Kira watched his face in the firelight, seeing the weight of memory settle on his shoulders like a mantle of lead. They came at dawn on the 2nd day. Not the small ones. The great worms, ancient beyond counting. We fought. God help us, we fought with everything we had. His hands clenched into fists. I watched them burn, all of them. My brothers, my friends, boys, barely old enough to grow beards. The dragons killed them like they were nothing. "But you survived," Kira whispered. "I ran." The words came out like a confession torn from his throat. "I dropped my sword and ran. Like a coward, while better men died for my failures." Kira reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his scarred knuckles. "You saved me." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you saved yourself, and I just happened to be there." She squeezed his hand tighter. "We saved each other." Above them, something roared in the distance, not threatening, but calling. The dragons were speaking again. The shrine lay hidden beneath centuries of overgrowth, revealed only when Kira stumbled over what she'd thought was a moss-covered boulder. But as Gareth pulled away the vines and brambles, ancient stone emerged, carved with such intricate detail that it seemed to breathe in the dappled forest light. "I've never seen anything like this," Gareth whispered, running his fingers over spirals and symbols that matched the mark on Kira's palm perfectly. Dragons wound around pillars in endless loops, their stone eyes seeming to follow movement, their carved mouths open as if frozen mid-song. Kira approached the central altar with growing wonder and terror. The stone beneath her feet hummed with power, and with each step, the mark on her palm grew warmer. When she placed her hand on the altar's surface, the entire shrine blazed to life. Light flowed through the carved channels like liquid starfire, illuminating words in the ancient script that somehow, impossibly, she could read. The story they told made her knees weak. "Once, humans and dragons were one people," she read aloud, her voice trembling. "Children born of both bloods, bridges between earth and sky. But fear divided what love had joined, and the bridge children were hunted, killed, forgotten." Gareth moved to stand beside her, his face pale in the magical light. "Dragonborn, that's what you are." "But I'm human," Kira protested, even as the words rang false in her own ears. "My mother was human, my father—" "Look," Gareth pointed to another section of text that had begun to glow brighter. "It says the blood can skip generations, lie dormant for centuries, but when it awakens—" He trailed off, reading ahead with growing amazement. "When it awakens, the bearer becomes a bridge once more," Kira finished, "capable of speaking to both kinds, understanding both hearts, healing the ancient wound." She touched her mark, watching it pulse in perfect rhythm with the shrine's light. "That's why the dragons called me sister. That's why my village burned." "The old pact your mother mentioned," Gareth said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "It wasn't just a treaty. It was about you, about what you represent." The light began to fade, but not before revealing one final truth carved deep into the altar's heart. Kira read it with a mixture of wonder and dread. The bridge child shall either unite the peoples or watch both perish in flames of their own making. As darkness settled over the shrine once more, Kira felt the weight of destiny settling on her small shoulders. She was 8 years old, alone except for one scarred knight, and the fate of 2 entire races somehow rested in her hands. "I don't know how to be a bridge," she whispered. Gareth knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "Then we'll learn together." In the distance, dragon calls echoed through the forest. Closer now, and growing closer still, the storm broke over the wasteland, like the wrath of gods, turning the sky black as pitch and sending lightning crackling between the mountains. But it wasn't the weather that made Kira's blood run cold. It was what rode within the storm clouds, scales gleaming wet in the flashes of light. Dozens of them. More dragons than she had ever imagined existed, their roars mixing with thunder, until earth and sky became one endless scream of fury. They descended like a living avalanche, wings blotting out what little light remained. "Run!" Gareth shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The wasteland stretched empty in every direction, offering no shelter, no hope. He raised his sword with grim determination, knowing it would be useless against such numbers. The first dragon landed with earth-shaking force, its crimson scales streaming with rain. Behind it came others, green as poisoned copper, black as midnight, silver as frozen starlight. Their eyes blazed with ancient hatred as they formed a circle around the knight and the girl. "So," hissed the red dragon, its voice like molten stone, "the bridge child shows herself at last. We have waited long to finish what our ancestors began." Kira stepped backward until she felt Gareth's armored form solid behind her. The mark on her palm burned like a brand, but this time she welcomed the pain. Power coursed through her veins, not the flickering light of before, but something vast and terrible that made her bones sing. "You will not harm him," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the very air shimmer. The dragons laughed, a sound like grinding millstones. "A child thinks to command us? We who ruled the skies when your ancestors cowered in caves?" The largest dragon, ancient beyond measure, stepped forward. The bridge children were an abomination, half-breeds with no place in either world. "We cleansed the earth of your kind once. We shall do so again." Lightning struck, and in that moment of blinding brightness, Kira's power exploded outward. Light poured from her skin like liquid fire, but this was not the gentle blue glow of before. This was starlight made solid, dragon flame turned to protection, instead of destruction. It washed over Gareth like armor, shielding him from claw and fang, while striking the attacking dragons like a physical blow. They reeled backward, shocked and suddenly uncertain. The girl who had cowered in ash fields now stood tall as any warrior, light streaming from her eyes, her voice carrying the authority of ancient kings. "I am Kira of the Bridge Blood," she declared, and her words echoed with power that shook the mountains. "I am the daughter of both peoples, and I will not let you destroy what could be healed." The red dragon snarled and lunged. Kira raised her hand, and a wall of pure light sent the great beast tumbling across the wasteland like a leaf in a hurricane. For the first time in 1,000 years, the dragons tasted fear. The wasteland fell silent except for the crackle of cooling stone and the whisper of settling ash. The defeated dragons had retreated to a respectful distance, their great forms hunched in what might have been shame or simply shock. Kira stood in the center of it all, her small body still wreathed in fading light, no longer the frightened child who had been left to die. From the mountains came another presence, older, vaster, moving with the slow dignity of ages. The ancient dragon that descended was white as winter clouds, its scales bearing the scars of countless battles. When it spoke, Its voice carried the weight of millennia. "I am Morveth the eldest," it said, folding wings that could have covered a village. "I remember the time before the breaking, when your kind and mine shared the same sky." Gareth tensed beside Kira, his hand moving instinctively to his sword, but she touched his arm gently. "It's different," she whispered. "This one doesn't want to fight." The ancient dragon's golden eyes fixed on her with something that might have been sadness. "You speak truly, bridge child. I come not for war, but for understanding. Tell me, do you know why we fell to hatred?" Kira felt the truth flow through her, carried on currents of memory that belonged to neither human nor dragon, but to both. The humans feared your power, the dragons despised human weakness, but it was the bridge children who paid the price for both sides' pride. "Yes," Morveth rumbled. "My own daughter was among them, born of flame and flesh, belonging fully to neither world. When the purges began, the great voice faltered. I failed to protect her." Gareth stepped forward, his weathered face etched with new understanding. "That's why you've been burning the villages. Not for conquest, for revenge, for grief," the elder dragon corrected. "Each human settlement reminded us of what we lost. But this child—" Morveth's gaze returned to Kira. "In her, I see my daughter's eyes. The bridge survives despite our efforts to destroy it." Kira moved closer to the ancient beast, feeling no fear now, only a deep well of shared sorrow. When she placed her small hand on Morveth's scarred snout, light flowed between them, not the harsh brilliance of battle, but something warm and healing. "The war doesn't have to continue," she said, her voice carrying to every dragon in the wasteland. "Humans and dragons both bleed, both mourn their dead, both want their children to grow up safe." Morveth's eyes closed, and for a moment the terrible weight of centuries seemed to lift from the dragon's shoulders. "You would forgive us after what we have done?" "I would heal us," Kira replied. "All of us." The elder dragon raised its great head and called out in the ancient tongue. One by one, the other dragons answered, their voices weaving together in a song that had not been heard for 1,000 years, a song of hope. The Dragon Council chamber carved into the mountain's heart was vast enough to hold cathedrals, its walls, lined with crystals that cast rainbow light across assembled representatives of two worlds. Ancient dragon lords perched on stone ledges like living gargoyles, while below them human nobles huddled in their finest robes, trying not to look as terrified as they felt. Kira stood in the center of it all, no longer the abandoned child from the ash fields, but something else entirely, a bridge between species that had forgotten how to speak to each other. The mark on her palm glowed steady as a heartbeat, translating words and emotions between minds that had been closed to each other for 1,000 years. "The terms are simple," declared Lord Aldwyn, the king's representative, his voice echoing. "Off-crystal walls, complete withdrawal from human territories, reparations for the villages destroyed, and guarantees that dragons will never again—" "Presumptuous whelp," interrupted Kael'thar the Red, his massive form radiating heat that made the humans sweat in their heavy clothes. "We offer peace, not surrender. Your kind will cease there, expansion into the sacred mountains, and we will consider not reducing your cities to ash." The negotiations had been going in circles for hours, pride and old hatred poisoning every attempt at compromise. Kira felt the weight of failure settling on her shoulders as voices rose in anger around her. "Enough," she said quietly, but her words carried such authority that the great chamber fell silent. Both dragons and humans turned to her with expressions ranging from hope to suspicion. "You're all fools," she continued, her child's voice somehow containing wisdom beyond her years. "You're arguing about terms when you should be talking about trust, about forgiveness, about building something new instead of trying to repair what's broken." Morveth the eldest leaned forward, his ancient eyes reflecting the crystal light. "Speak your mind, bridge child. What would you have us do?" Kira took a deep breath, feeling the words that would change everything forming in her throat. "The peace will only hold if both sides have something to lose, something precious enough to fight for." She looked around the chamber, meeting human and dragon gazes equally. "I propose myself as surety. I will live half the year with the dragons, learning their ways, and half with humans, learning theirs. If either side breaks the treaty, they lose me forever." Gareth started forward, his face pale with sudden understanding. "Kira, no, you're just a child. This burden shouldn't—" "I'm not just a child anymore," she said gently, and he could see the truth of it in her glowing eyes. "I'm what I was born to be, the bridge, the bond between worlds." The chamber erupted in debate, but Kira had already made her choice. She would give up the simple life she'd never really had for the hope of a future where no more villages burned, where no more children died alone in the ash. The border monument rose from green meadowland like a prayer-made stone, half human. Craftsmanship, half dragon artistry joined seamlessly where fire met faith. Kira stood before it on the anniversary of the treaty's signing, no longer the frightened child who had once pressed her face into burning ash, but not yet the woman she would become. At 12, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of one who had walked between worlds and found her place in both. "Are you ready?" Gareth asked, though he already knew the answer. He had aged in the 4 years since their first meeting, silver threading his beard, new lines etched around his eyes. But his voice still held the same gentle strength that had first made her feel safe. "I'm always ready," Kira replied, adjusting. The simple pack that held her belongings. Today marked her transition from the human lands to the dragon territories for the summer season. A journey she had made 8 times now, each crossing easier than the last. Around them, the assembled crowd represented what would have been impossible just years ago. Human merchants chatted with young dragons about trade routes through the mountains. Children from nearby villages played games with dragonkin cubs, their laughter mixing in the warm afternoon air. A group of scholars, both human and dragon, debated the finer points of ancient history with the passion of old friends. "The delegation from the northern kingdoms arrived this morning," Gareth said, nodding toward a group of nervous-looking nobles. "They're still adjusting to the idea of dragons as allies rather than monsters." Kira smiled, remembering her own terror in those first days. "They'll learn. Everyone does, given time." As if summoned by her words, Morveth descended from the clear sky, his white scales catching the sunlight like polished pearl. He landed with practiced grace near the monument, careful not to disturb the crowd of mixed peoples below. "Little bridge," he rumbled fondly, using the name that had replaced all others between them. "Are you prepared for this season's lessons?" "What will you teach me this time?" she asked, approaching without fear. "Patience," the ancient dragon replied, with what might have been humor. "The northern kingdoms are finally ready to join the treaty, but their ambassadors will need gentle persuasion." Kira laughed, a sound bright with confidence earned through trial and fire. "Then we'd better not keep them waiting." As she climbed onto Morveth's broad back, she caught Gareth's eye. The knight who had once saved a dying child in the wasteland now served as humanity's primary liaison to the dragon courts. They had both found their purposes in the new world they had helped build. "Until autumn," Gareth called. "Until autumn," she agreed, and then they were airborne, riding toward a future where the sky belonged to everyone. Below them, the border monument gleamed in the sun, a symbol of what could be built when courage met compassion, when bridges were built instead of walls, where fire met faith, hope took wing.